Good evening and welcome. Today's report focuses on a proposed 28-point plan to end the war in Ukraine, the political and military crisis surrounding it, and why this document has already provoked such strong reactions in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington. The story begins with a sense of mounting pressure on Ukraine. The country finds itself in a difficult and dangerous position. A deep political crisis overlaps with a grinding military confrontation, while major foreign partners push for a rapid end to hostilities. Against this backdrop, Washington is promoting a peace framework that many in Ukraine view less as a roadmap to peace and more as an ultimatum that locks in Russian territorial gains and restricts Ukraine's future choices. According to public reporting, the initiative is built around a document drafted with input from negotiator Steve Witkoff and Russian Sovereign Fund chief Kirill Dmitriev, then refined within the current United States administration. It is presented as a comprehensive solution with 28 detailed points, but critics argue that, in its current form, it resembles a managed freeze of the conflict rather than a genuine settlement that restores Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. At the heart of the plan is a promise to confirm Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. Yet many of the concrete provisions that follow, from limits on the Ukrainian armed forces to a permanent ban on membership in the North Atlantic Alliance, raise questions about how much real sovereignty would remain in practice. The proposed framework seeks to bind not only Kyiv, but also the alliance and European partners, fixing hard red lines on enlargement and security posture for years to come. The document opens with a pledge to formalize a comprehensive non-aggression pact between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, declaring disputes of the past 3 decades resolved. It assumes that Russia will refrain from future invasions of neighboring states, while the North Atlantic Alliance commits not to expand further, effectively freezing the security map of the continent. For many in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, this is seen as a significant concession, a legal seal under a status quo shaped by force rather than by free choice. Next, the plan outlines a structured dialogue between Russia and the alliance, mediated by the United States, to address security concerns and create conditions for de-escalation and economic cooperation. In theory, this is presented as a way to lower tensions and build a more stable European order, with Washington in a central convening role. However, critics warn that such a setup risks sidelining Ukraine and other affected states, effectively turning them into objects rather than full participants in decisions about their own security. One of the most sensitive pillars concerns security guarantees for Ukraine. The draft promises reliable guarantees, but then immediately defines strict military constraints, including a cap on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. In practice, this means that at a time when Ukraine has mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to defend itself, the country would be required to cut its forces down to a fixed ceiling, even while a hostile neighbor maintains a far larger military. For many in Kyiv, this looks less like protection and more like managed vulnerability. Another core provision would lock Ukraine out of the North Atlantic Alliance permanently. The plan calls for Kyiv to write into its own constitution a binding pledge never to join, while the alliance would amend its founding documents to bar Ukrainian membership in the future. The North Atlantic Alliance would also commit not to deploy combat forces on Ukrainian territory. The result is a structural barrier. One major avenue for security integration is not simply postponed, but closed off by treaty, even as Ukraine remains on the front line of confrontation with Russia. The draft then moves to a set of provisions that aim to reassure European allies. It foresees stationing European fighter aircraft in Poland and anchoring a series of additional security measures on Allied territory rather than inside Ukraine. At the same time, Washington offers what it describes as guarantees. If Russia attacks Ukraine again after the agreement, there would be a decisive, coordinated response and a snapback of sanctions and diplomatic penalties. Yet, the precise nature of any military response and the level of risk Western governments are willing to accept remain deliberately vague. The economic section of the plan is expansive. It envisages Ukraine gaining preferential access to the European market and receiving significant reconstruction aid through a dedicated Ukraine Development Fund and special programs coordinated with international financial institutions. Under this model, frozen Russian assets would partly be redirected into projects on Ukrainian territory, with the United States and European partners managing large investment packages and, in some versions, sharing in the profits generated by these funds. Proponents describe this as a way to turn Russian capital into rebuilding. Skeptics see a system that could dilute the punitive effect of asset freezes while creating complex new financial dependencies. Side by side with Ukrainian recovery, the text also outlines a path for the gradual reintegration of Russia into the global economy. It sketches a staged process of lifting sanctions, reopening access to Western markets, and eventually inviting Moscow back into elite clubs, such as an expanded group of major industrialized states. The proposed framework even describes long-term cooperation between Washington and Moscow in fields such as energy, mining, and advanced technologies, once certain conditions are met. This is framed as a way to give Russia an incentive not to return to war, though history shows that intense economic ties did not prevent earlier escalations. In the security realm, several points deal with arms control and non-proliferation. The plan calls for Washington and Moscow to extend existing agreements on strategic nuclear arsenals and to reaffirm mutual commitments under global non-proliferation regimes. Ukraine would confirm its nuclear-free status, remaining bound by the treaty that limits the spread of nuclear weapons. These measures aim to reduce the risk of a broader strategic confrontation, but they do not, on their own, resolve the issue of conventional imbalance and ongoing conventional attacks. A particularly contentious element centers on nuclear energy infrastructure. The draft suggests placing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant under the supervision of the International Atomic Watchdog, with electricity output evenly shared between Russia and Ukraine. The intention is to diffuse immediate safety risks and ensure continued civilian use, but many in Ukraine argue that rewarding control over a plant seized during the war sends a dangerous message about hostage-taking of critical infrastructure. The text also ventures into the social and humanitarian sphere. It proposes educational programs in both countries to promote mutual understanding and tolerance, as well as measures to protect linguistic and religious minorities. It calls for the removal of discriminatory policies and guarantees of media and education rights for communities that use either Ukrainian or Russian. At the same time, it insists that all forms of explicitly extremist ideology must be rejected and banned in both societies, an attempt to shut down narratives that dehumanize the other side. Territorial questions form the core political burden of the draft. The plan states that Crimea, as well as the entire Donetsk and Luhansk regions, would be recognized as de facto Russian territory, including by the United States. The Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions would be frozen along existing lines of contact, effectively transforming today's front line into a new de facto border. Russia would retain these gains, while pledging to withdraw only from smaller pockets captured outside the 5 regions specified in the text. Further, the proposal would require Ukrainian forces to pull back from the parts of Donetsk region they currently hold. This withdrawn strip would become a demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation, even though Russian troops would not deploy inside it. Supporters argue this could reduce the risk of immediate clashes. Opponents stress that it cedes not only land, but also leverage, and may create a stepping stone for future advances deeper into Ukrainian territory. Once new territorial lines are agreed, both countries would formally commit never to alter them by force. The agreement underlines that any use of military means to challenge, These arrangements would automatically void key security guarantees and economic benefits built into the plan. In other words, Ukraine is asked to seal in place a map that many of its citizens consider the result of illegal occupation, in exchange for promises of stability and assistance. The humanitarian section lays out a mechanism to address the most painful consequences of the war. It calls for the creation of a dedicated committee to organize a full exchange of all remaining prisoners and the return of all recovered bodies on an all-for-all basis. All civilian detainees and hostages, including deported children, would be returned, and a family reunification program would be launched to reconnect those separated by front lines and borders. Additional steps would aim to support victims of violence and displacement, though many technical details are left open. On Ukraine's internal politics, the text sets an ambitious timeline. Once a ceasefire is in force and legal conditions allow, the country would be expected to organize national elections within 100 days. The stated idea is to renew political legitimacy after years of martial law and wartime governance. However, critics warn that compressing such a complex process into such a short period, especially amid deep social trauma and unresolved security threats, could fuel instability rather than reconciliation. One of the most controversial legal provisions is a blanket amnesty. The plan declares that all parties to the conflict would receive complete immunity for actions committed during the war, and that no claims or legal proceedings would be pursued in the future in relation to those acts. This is designed to reassure decision-makers in Moscow, Kiev, and elsewhere that signing the agreement does not expose them to prosecution. For many victims and human rights advocates, it looks like a sweeping erasure of accountability. To administer and enforce the entire framework, the document foresees a peace council chaired by the current President of the United States. This body would monitor compliance, report violations, and coordinate the reimposition of sanctions or other penalties against any party that breaks the terms. Such a structure would give Washington an unusually central role in managing the post-war order in Eastern Europe, something that is welcomed by some allies and viewed with caution by others. Finally, the plan states that once all sides formally accept the document, a ceasefire will come into effect immediately after Ukrainian and Russian forces withdraw to the agreed new lines. Only then would the broader package of security guarantees, economic measures, elections, and institutional reforms begin to unfold in stages. For now, however, both Ukrainian and Russian officials have signaled serious reservations, and there is no clear path to the unanimous consent the plan requires. As Ukraine weighs this proposal, the war on the ground continues and diplomatic discussions remain fluid. What is clear is that any document of this scale will shape not only front lines, but also the long-term architecture of security, justice, and economic relations in the region. And its fate will depend on whether it can reconcile those demands with the expectations of societies that have already paid a very high price.